Thank you, Em. I guess in this day and age, the best thing about being a guest speaker is you get to take your mask off. So, thanks to all of you for coming tonight. Let me begin by saying that my goal in writing this biography of Harriet Smith Pullen was to shine a light on my connection to this woman, because she's my great-grandmother, one of my great-grandmothers. She died before I was born. And learning about her was muddied by the fact that she was both the subject and the source of myriad crazy, outlandish stories that I heard about her as I grew up. You know what family stories can be like. But as a historian, I wanted to know what really happened. I wanted to separate fact from fiction. So how the book came to be, in 2005, my husband, who's here tonight, and I went to a conference, a professional conference in Seattle. And while we were there, I thought that I should go out to La Push, Washington. Here you can see La Push is on the Pacific coast, far west side of the state. So we drove out there. It was a couple of hours drive. And the goal was to find the former location of this rather grand house, which is a house that Harriet and her husband Daniel Pullen built. And I had pictures of it. I had this picture, so I knew it was there. But I was really curious. Yeah, that works. That's good. Yeah, I can see. I was really curious as to where it was and if anybody there knew anything about it. We knew that the village was the center of the Quileute people, Indian tribe, the center of their reservation. And we just kind of drove around the village, and we eventually ended up in a gift shop, and there were two women behind the counter. And I asked them, do you know anything about the house that was built by Harriet and Daniel Pullen? And when she heard the name Pullen, her face just lit up, and she proceeded to tell us that their tribal elder, who was Lillian Pullen, who died just a couple of years before, and she pointed, there were pictures of Lillian on the wall behind her, and she talked to us about her son, Joe Pullen, and she was very excited at the idea that I was related to this woman. And then she said, are you enrolled? And I had no idea what she meant. She was asking me, was I enrolled in their tribe? And I wasn't. And we tried to make contact with Joe, the son, but he was unavailable. I wrote to him, but I never got a response. I was living in New York at the time. So the question that I was left with was, how did the name Pullen, which is actually a name, English roots, but it was a Maine name, because Daniel Pullen was from Maine for many generations. How did it end up in this Indian tribe in the state of Washington? And it led me to ask, am I part Native American, which I didn't think I was. Well, the view from the house today is this, and you can see, it's a little hard to discern, but in the distance is the Pacific Ocean, and this rather dramatic island, they call them sea stacks, and what you see in the foreground is just part of the Quileute village, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like today. Now this is what Harriet looked like some of the time. I have an original print of this photograph, and she had herself photographed not only like this, facing forward, but there's a profile view, and then there's kind of a back view. And you know, she was a woman of quite a big ego, I think. And some of the time she looked like this. And here she is in Alaska, next to the railroad tracks, in not a Quileute outfit, but rather a Canadian Indian tribe. And I'll talk a little bit about what she's wearing later. Now the family legacy that I grew up with is because my mother knew her a little bit. My mother lived in North Carolina. She was in Washington and Alaska by the time my mother came along. So they only saw each other a couple of times. But my mother did spend a summer working for her in Alaska. She was in college and she was working in the hotel as a waitress for like 3 months. So she kind of got to know her grandmother as an old woman. But the stories that I grew up with, as I said before, were really pretty wild and pretty crazy, and they were part of my childhood. Now, one of the stories was in the form of a 1948 radio play, which aired on Cavalcade of America. I have in the past often said, oh, maybe some of you remember, but I don't think anyone here is old enough to remember radio plays from the 40s. But it later became a TV series called Cavalcade of America. And somebody wrote Harriet's story, and my parents were able to get a recording, an audio recording of this radio play, and they would play it for me and my siblings periodically. And I'm going to read just a little part of the script, and you'll have to imagine that the voice of Harriet is that of Irene Dunn. You may have heard of her. She was a 4-time Oscar Best Actress nominee, and she played the part of Harriet in this play. So it begins with the narrator who says, 1897, the year gold was discovered in the Klondike. It was midsummer of that year when Harriet first saw the coast of Alaska, and then there's a toot-toot of a boat. So Harriet says, I took the boat up from Seattle, jam-packed with prospectors, hard, cruel men mostly, who came looking for something, gold, success, adventure, but not me. All I wanted was a job. I had to have a job. Well, I had my reasons, 4 good ones. So then the steamer pulls into the harbor, and Harriet maneuvers her way through a throng of men, and with no available wharf, climbs down a ladder slung over the side of the boat. A man named Mac approaches her and offers her a job, which she accepts on the spot. So Mac says to her, where are you going to live, in a tent? Harriet, an old miner who owns a cabin on the beach is going back to the States. It only has 1 room, but any furniture? It's got a stove. Nothing else? No. Not a bed, nor a table, nor a chair. You call that a home for your children? Mrs. Pullen, I can't figure you out. You look like something out of a tea party, but you talk like Mrs. Daniel Boone. And Harriet says, do I? Mr. Mack, all I know is I'm going to build a new life for me and my children. So Harriet is actually pretty famous in Alaska. In fact, she is mentioned in one of Sarah Palin's biographies as a model of a strong Alaska woman. And I always have heard that Harriet was 6 feet tall and had red hair down to her ankles. My mother swore that that was true. Of course, she wore her hair up on her head. And those 2 tidbits turned out to be true. I think she really was 6 feet at least with probably her shoes on. And she did have red hair down to her ankles based on evidence that other people published. So those 2 tidbits turned out to be true, but I wanted to know more, and I wanted to know what really happened, not just these crazy stories. So I got started writing about history about 12 years ago with my first book, which was titled An Uncommon Cape. And it's the history of a property, and property in New York. And my academic training is in art history, but the methodology for regular history is really very much the same. So I decided to try writing this biography next. During my research, I made a discovery, and that was Harriet's father's diary. It's in the Washington State Library archives. His father, Harriet's father's father, was an abolitionist, and very active in the Underground Railroad. He lived in Pennsylvania at the time, and he would transport formerly enslaved people up north to Canada, where they could seek freedom. The funny thing was that while I'd heard a lot about Harriet, I never heard a word about this father, who seemed like a very interesting character. So he has become the subject of my most recent book, which isn't out yet, but I'm working on that. But anyway, the story of Harriet's youth, even though I found like 70 articles and chapters of books about her, the story of her younger years had never been told. And this diary, where you can see what it looks like here, allowed me to sort of shape that part of her history. So as a child, she and her family, she had 7 siblings, they made their way across the continent, part of the Yankee diaspora, from New York to Pennsylvania, where her father grew up, and then homesteading in Wisconsin, and then homesteading in South Dakota. And at that point, they took a covered wagon from Wisconsin to South Dakota. But in Dakota, they endured prairie fires and floods and blizzards and droughts and repeated grasshopper plagues, something out of the Bible. And they were trying to be farmers, so this was all devastating. Yeah.
Can you just tell us the year? Or
the year?
Yeah, when was that?
Let's see. AJ was born, her father was born in 1832, and he went to Wisconsin to homestead in 1852. He was 20 years old. Is this right? And then Harriet was born in 1860 in Wisconsin, and the family, father fought in the Civil War, and after the Civil War, he got a chance to see South Dakota during the war because he was stationed at a fort in Dakota Territory.
Harriet was about 7 in 1867.
Yeah.
So that's about when.
And so in, I think it was 1868, they moved to South Dakota and lived there for 6 or 7 years. And at that point, her father threw in the towel and he said, "I'm going to Washington State." He had heard good things about it. He got on. By that time, they didn't have to take a covered wagon. He took a train because the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished in 1869. And Harriet, her mother, and the 7 siblings joined him in Washington, and that's AJ, that's the father. As a young man, he's in his Civil War uniform in this picture. About 6 years later, she marries this Dan Pullen, who's on the right. Now, and Harriet's on the left, and those earrings that she's wearing, I have on tonight. And it's the only thing of hers that I inherited. But Dan was a fur trader, an Indian fur trader, and a 5th generation Mainer. His father owned a sawmill in China, Maine, South China, Maine, but dies of scarlet fever when Dan was 8. So his mother struggles. She's got 9 children that she's trying to raise, and it seems by the time Dan became an adult, there was really nothing for him in Maine. And he and his older brother take off for the West, and they end up in Washington State. It was 1861 when he arrived in Washington. Now, Dan might have left to avoid being drafted into the Union Army. He might have failed the physical, or he did have some Quaker heritage, so he may have been a pacifist. It's not really clear why he left Maine. But at the time, the whole idea of go west, young man, was kind of the cry of the time, you know, find your fortune in the West, which is what he did. So some years later, Harriet and Dan build this quite grand house. In the lower left, you can see AJ, her father, with his white beard. He had joined her by that point. She's picking berries in the foreground, and the two little boys in the middle with the family dog are two of her 4 children. Now, there's nothing like this house for at least 100 miles. There might have been some houses in Tacoma or Seattle or something like, but nothing out on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. It overlooked the Pacific. I mean, it's really just like a stone's throw from the ocean. You can see in this aerial view the sea stacks, and the arrow points to the spot where the house was. Today, that spot is a Coast Guard, some kind of Coast Guard station. So, you know, it was a beautiful house, beautiful location, beautiful view, but there's a but, and this is a rather big but, and that is that the house overlooked the village that belonged to the Quileutes. And here you can see some of the housing that they had right on the beach. The house is up behind it. This is that same view today. And in this picture, again, this is kind of a view from where the house would have been. You can see the family, including Harriet and her couple of her siblings, sort of lounging on the grass, and then right over the cliff are the houses of the Quileute people. And again, that remarkable sea stack in the distance. In this picture, the Quileutes are skinning a whale. Whales were really central to their lives, both in terms of what they ate. They sold the oil from the whales. Everything revolved around spearing whales. And the people there are a combination of members of the families, and you know, the Pullen family and some of the other white settlers, and the Quileutes. So Dan and Harriet's choice to homestead in the middle of an Indian village is really at the heart of conflicts and the circumstances that led to the dissolution of their marriage. I could never find any evidence that they divorced, but the marriage was effectively over, and it's really part of what drove Harriet to Alaska to make her fortune in the Klondike Gold Rush in 1897. She was 37 years old at the time. So this is what Skagway looks like today, or in the last couple of decades. And this is what it looked like when she arrived in 1897. When she gets there, at first she tells everybody that she's a widow. And in the book, I speculate on what the reasons for that might have been. You know, there are several reasons one could come up with. But there's one clear reason that stands out, and it's something that I learned about after the book came out, so I wasn't able to include it in the book, but it's something called coverture. Coverture is a long-standing legal concept with roots in English common law. And it says that a married woman was legally one and the same with her husband. Harriet would have had to turn over any earnings to her husband. She would have been barred from owning property herself. And this was still the law in Washington State until the 1890s. It actually had changed in the mid-90s. But when she got to Alaska, I think she had no idea what the law in Alaska was. Alaska was truly the Wild West at that point. It was only made a district of the U.S. at that point, and it didn't even become a territory of the U.S. until 1912. And I think that their legal system was rudimentary at best, and she was undoubtedly certain as to what her rights were. So she didn't want to take any chances. I think it was probably a wise decision on her part. So she cooks for a living. This guy, Mac, that she meets on the beach, supposedly offered her a job as a cook. And she then started making and selling dried apple pies. I'm not sure where she got the apples. I think they got shipped up from Washington. She took old tin cans and hammered them into baking pans. And she made enough money to send for her 4 children. She went up there alone. And then she sent for her horses. She had managed to hang on to 2 or 3 horses from her farm, her ranch in Washington. And she uses those horses to pack supplies up into the mountains where the gold is to be found. And the book's title, The Queen of Heartbreak Trail, actually comes from this trail because those prospectors usually came back empty-handed and broken-hearted.
Yeah.
And Harriet, as the person who was helping them get into the mountains, was the place where you got the gold was 500 miles from Skagway. But that's where the title of the book comes from.
What was her age at this time when she moved to Alaska?
What
was her age?
She was 37 when she arrived, and yeah.
And who looked after her children while she took off?
She made arrangements. Her 2 oldest sons went and stayed with her husband, her estranged husband, who had gone. You know, when they had that house and that ranch, he was by far the wealthiest man in the area. But there was a conflict with the U.S. government, and it lasted 10 years, court battle. But in the end, the U.S. government took their property, and when she left, she sort of saw the writing on the wall. The whole business wasn't settled until almost 1900, but the U.S. government took their property and gave it back to the Quileutes, and the Quileutes are there to this very day. So the husband was devastated. He went back to working in a sawmill or something like that, and so Harriet, to answer your question, sent the 2 oldest boys to stay with their father at this, it was a logging camp, not a sawmill. The girl got sent to boarding school, and the youngest son stayed with her aunt, or some relative. But after several months, she got the money together, and she had all 4 of the kids come up to Skagway. And in fact, her husband came too, which was kind of a problem. She told everybody she was a widow, but it didn't last long. He tried to get work on the railroad, and the marriage wasn't working. And she was really empowered at this point, and he just went back to Seattle and lived out the rest of his life, which was about another decade, and really died as a very sad, pathetic person. So Harriet made enough money to first lease an old mansion that had been built by a sea captain. She turned it into a boarding house and eventually bought it outright and made it into a hotel. And in this picture, you see her on her carriage. The place was called the Pullen House, and she would use that carriage to drive down to the dock to pick up her guests. And not too long, the gold rush was essentially over by about 1900. Skagway soon became a tourist destination, which it is to this day. Those big cruise liners that come into Portland and Maine and other places on the Maine coast, they pull in to Skagway like every week with thousands of hundreds of people. And that history, except for the world wars, that history of tourism has really sustained the town of Skagway, which I think today has about 800 people who live in it.
Is the house still standing?
No, the house,
No.
I saw the house because I was there in the 60s when I was a teenager. I went there with my parents, and the house was there, standing at that point, but it was falling apart. I mean, I remember looking in a window and there was a tree growing through the floor. And a couple of years after that, maybe around 1970, it was determined that it was a hazard and it was torn down. And the heirs, the family that owned it, you know, I guess just lost it. I'm not sure the details of that. So Harriet raises the 4 children on her own. Here they are, the sons and the daughter. She sent all 4 of them to college at a time when only 3% of the U.S. population attended college. The boys all went to the University of Washington. The girl was sent to nursing school in New York City. And the oldest one, the boy in the center, who was my grandfather, then left the University of Washington and went to West Point. He was the first, he was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, actually. He was the first cadet appointed to West Point from Alaska. Harriet even bought a farm, yet another homestead. This one was in Alaska, a few miles from Skagway. And she did it because she wanted to supply the hotel with fresh milk and beef and produce. And here you see her proudly posing with her cows. And she's on the cover of a book that came out maybe 10 years ago called Women to Reckon With, Untamed Women of the Olympic Wilderness. And it's a collection of stories about maybe a dozen women from the Olympic Peninsula, and she's one of them. Harriet also found time to encourage people to vote, and you can't really read it in this image, but this banner on this carriage says vote. Now, women gained the right to vote in Alaska in 1913, which is true of a lot of the western states, you know, before it became a constitutional amendment. So she would go around town and pick people up and take them to the polls so they could vote. So for 50 years, she ran this hotel. She died in 1947. And she regaled her guests with these fabulous stories. The Gold Rush stories in particular fascinated the tourists. And she had quite an interesting life, so she had a lot of stories to tell, and she became a rather well-known raconteur. Here she is in a shirt. This is the one we saw her in before. It's made by the Klondike people, who were a tribe in Western Canada, and she would wear this outfit when she told her stories. One of the other attractions at the hotel, besides her, because she was quite a character, was her collection. She had a collection of Gold Rush stuff. I don't know what happened to my...
Behind you.
Oh, here it is. This is her authentic gold panning thing from the Gold Rush. This was... her collection was sold in the 1960s by one of her granddaughters, not my mother, but another granddaughter. And somebody bought it, and I guess another descendant bought it at the auction. And that that man's daughter, who is, maybe my age, I'm not sure, I've never met her, but she's a cousin, and she managed to find me after the book came out. We corresponded, and at one point she sent me a whole bunch of pictures that I'd never seen.
Did she send you any gold nuggets? Send you any gold dust? Any gold dust?
I don't know, but I have a gold nugget bracelet. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
It's just something that I guess my mother bought in Alaska. I don't actually know where it came from. But this woman kindly sent me the gold pan, and she said, you know, I don't have any children, you have a daughter, you have to make sure it stays in the family, so it hangs on our dining room wall right now. It's kind of like modern art. So this Klondike shirt was was fascinating to me because it's so beautiful, and I actually found a picture of the actual shirt, which you can tell by comparing photographs. I found it online, but it didn't identify where it was, so I did a little bit of sleuthing and eventually learned that it's in the collection of the Seattle Art Museum. And it's made of ermine, and it was given to Harriet by an Indian chief who, on his deathbed, she cared for him, and he gave her this. And here she is, again, by the railroad tracks, and the Klondike shirt.
She looks so young.
So a little bit about my writing. People always ask me about my writing and my research process. And I mentioned earlier that I found 70 articles and chapters in books about Harriet. And I traced the origins of all the stories that appeared in those publications. And I analyzed kind of how they got passed from one writer to another and how they got distorted. And I want to read a paragraph from a publication. Now, this is a description of Harriet at a time when she would have been close to 60, when she homesteaded that farm so that she could have milk and beef for her hotel. In order to stake her homestead claim, she had to build a cabin, and she had to sort of live there, and that was the law at the time. But there were so-called claim jumpers, people who would try to horn in and get the property. So the claim jumpers were trying to get her farm, and this writer describes the following. A fine figure of a woman she was then, a splendid red-headed young matron sitting her horse sideways in the long, tight-fitting riding habit of the time, but riding, by gad, like a Plains Indian. Now remember, she was 60 at this point, so who knows if that's true. And she certainly had her dander up that day. She came galloping out of the forest and charged down on the jumpers, skirts a-flying, hair all tumbled to her waist, and a revolver spitting bullets. The jumpers moved off her land, but they kept sneaking back. In order to protect her rights, Mrs. Pullen went over there and lived in the little cabin for a while. Many a time she sat up all night, a Winchester across her knee, watching for the jumpers. In the end, she won out. She did. She got the homestead property. So in the absence of any diaries by Harriet herself, I only found one or maybe two letters. Maybe it was 2 or 3 letters that she wrote. There was really very little to go on. So I had to draw conclusions largely from her father's diary and also from Harriet's actions and experiences and the world that she lived in at the time. As part of my research, I traced with Michael Harriet's steps, and I found all the homesteads where she lived in Wisconsin, in South Dakota, in Washington, and in Alaska. And in the documents that I found in libraries, archives, courthouses, I mentioned the lawsuits. There were hundreds of pages of handwritten transcripts of these court cases. And I encountered a variety of themes in my research that required doing additional research because I didn't know anything about them, and a brief mention in the book, things like Quakers and abolitionists and scarlet fever and homesteading and the Yankee diaspora and grasshopper plagues and the Quileute Indians, and then Twilight. I think Em was very kind to find this book in the Rockland Library. How many of you are familiar with this, the Twilight Saga? Well, it was enormously popular, what, 5-10 years
About
ago?
7
I'm
years
not
ago,
sure.
8 years ago.
Particularly among young readers. And there were five books in the series. And now there's several films that have come out. The story is basically about, it's a romantic fantasy book, and it's about werewolves and vampires, right? And teenagers. And the whole story takes place in the town of Forks, Washington, and in La Push, Washington. And the character named Jacob Black, who plays the werewolf, the teenage werewolf, you know, these characters morph in and out between people and vampires and werewolves. Jacob is a member of the Quileute tribe. So this series of books, when they came out, really put La Push and the Quileute people on the map. And, you know, there were mixed feelings about it. Some people thought it was, you know, it was tacky and, you know, inappropriate. And other people in the tribe embraced it as a way of, like I said, putting the Quileute people on the map. And we happened to be out there during, what was it called? Twilight Days or something. And there were kids riding these vehicles on the beach and, I don't know, whooping it up, and they were wearing fangs like werewolves. I mean, it was a big deal. I think it's probably died down by now, but one of the things that came out of it was that the Smithsonian and the Seattle Art Museum sort of joined forces, and they used it as an opportunity to tell the Quileute folklore, their real tribal stories. And there was an exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum so people could understand more about the Quileute people. So anyway, in my writing, I have to alternate between writing and researching and, you know, finding things and having to do more research. But the overall goal is to separate the fact from the fiction. So I will end with these images. Harriet with a parrot and a bouquet of flowers on the left, and Harriet on the right wearing a top hat, which inexplicably she liked to wear. I'm not quite sure why. She's on the street in Skagway. And on her lapel, well, around her neck are Indian beads, and on her left lapel are all the medals that her son, also named Daniel Pullen, the one that went to West Point, he went on to be quite a hero in the First World War in France, and, you know, won medal of, I forget, I can't remember the names, but medals from Belgium and France and the US, and he died rather young, and by this point he was already dead. So she had his medals, and she would walk around wearing them, and she was quoted in one Washington State newspaper as saying, well, people laugh at me all the time, but I don't care, I'm going to wear it anyway.
Yeah.
So since the book was released, I've been getting emails from people who are reading the book, and that continues even now, even though the book came out in 2016. And I thought I'd share just one of them with you. This is from a Pullen cousin, again, someone I never met until the time of the book, but she happens to live in Maine, and I happened to meet her, and her name is Ruthie, and she wrote me and quoted another cousin, also someone I've never met, but I think somebody that lives in Colorado. She said, "Thank you, Ruthie, for telling her about the book. I'll get the book and tell my Pullens about it too. We heard many times about Harriet from Mother, whose emphasis was that Harriet was a Pullen by marriage only, not a true Pullen. The new book may describe Harriet as a, quote, entrepreneur and hotelier, but Mother said she ran a brothel. All those men, so few women, which was the case in the Gold Rush,
Right.
you know, we have a photo of her in front of her establishment. I don't think she was running a brothel, but who knows what went on in that hotel. It's one of the rumors that I address in the book, and what this person didn't know is that Dan Pullen, her ancestor and Harriet's husband, was actually much more a person of questionable morals than was Harriet, and that's a whole nother part of the story, which I think led to the U.S. government getting them off the property.
Wow.
And you know, it's kind of the reverse of the story that we hear all the time about the white settlers coming in and taking the land from Native Americans, but in this case, it was the opposite.
Huh.
So, thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address
How old
them.
did she live to be?
What's that?
How old did she live to be?
She lived to be 85
Oh.
in 1947. She
Okay,
died.
85. In Alaska.
She did die in Alaska. In fact, she left a strict request that she be buried next to the railroad tracks,
Oh.
which was right next to her property where that hotel was, and it's still there. There's a, you know, some kind of like a wooden cross or something that marks the spot. And even though, by that time Alaska wasn't a state yet, but even though the law said you had to be buried in a cemetery, they made an exception for Harriet, and she was buried right there by the railroad tracks.
What a fascinating woman, yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, to tell everybody that all those medals belong to your grandfather.
Her
Yeah.
son.
I mean,
Yeah, the
your-
one that went to West Point.
Yeah, to your,
To
your
your,
grand-
that's your grandfather?
Yeah, her oldest son was my
Is your
grandfather.
Who
He
went to-
sadly died at the age of 38 of a
Oh.
brain tumor.
Oh.
Although I think what happened to him in the wars
Yeah.
probably caused brain damage, because he was in tanks and
Uh-huh.
getting bombarded, and you know there were a lot of things
Yes.
going on. And, you know, no one will ever know.
Right.
But he was back. He died at Walter Reed Hospital he was an Army officer, and I have a lot of those medals now, because as my mother was his only child, so this stuff went to her and then came to me. So, yeah.
What are some of the stories
What's
that
that?
you've
You have to
heard?
speak up.
What are some of the crazy stories that you heard, true or not, about her?
What were some of the other stories?
Yeah, some of the
Um,
crazier ones.
Well, the one about the hair down to her ankles.
Oh.
But besides my mother vouching for that, I've read articles written, I mean, you know, people who were interviewed in, you know, maybe the 1960s or something, who supposedly she washed her hair once a year.
Oh,
You know, so if you have that much hair,
What
you
about the
can't
lice
hop
back
in
in
the
those
shower.
days? Hope
And
she didn't get lice.
these women helped her wash her hair,
Yeah.
because it was quite a production.
Yeah.
What are some of the other stories that I heard? She stayed in Alaska, you know, all those years, although she did travel to Washington State a couple of times and was interviewed by journalists in the Seattle area. She also went to Washington, D.C. For some sort of event for the mothers of World War I soldiers or officers or something. So while she was in Washington, D.C., taking the train, of course, in those days, would have been in the early 20s, she went down to North Carolina and met my mother as a little girl. And because my mom was only 16 months when her father died, so at that point, he was already gone.
There was that book that came out that said that Harriet could not have been in the push in 1897,
Yeah.
1990, and that she couldn't have witnessed the shooting,
Right.
and What was that, what was the name of that?
Well, there was some, kind of Wild West stuff that went on in Skagway, and Harriet claimed to have witnessed it, and some scholar actually came out with a book about 5 years ago that said that was impossible, but that woman didn't know what I knew, and I think it was a fact that Harriet did see what she claimed to have seen. They also said that she had a white horse, and she would ride her horse in parades up and down the main street of
I bet she did.
of Skagway. Yeah. And she learned how to ride on the farms and ranches that she lived in, and she knew how to breed horses.
And speaking of that, there was a the trail that she where she packed the horses and packed the homesteader stuff up. What was it, about 18 miles or something like that?
Well,
it was also called the horse.
The gold fields were really literally 500 miles,
yeah.
but she would in her horses pack them up part of the way. I don't know, 20 miles or something, and people used to say, "Oh, she couldn't have done that," but the fact is, she did do it. And her two sons, her oldest sons, were there. They were, young teenagers at that point, and they helped her. But she's the one who got on the horse or the wagon or however she did it, and did it herself.
And there are two trails out of Skagway. The one you often see the picture of the snow and the line of men and so on. That's the Heartbreak Trail. There was another trail on the right side of the mountains that now has a train track on it that she rode with her wagon. And that one was called something about horses, because it was where the horses would go, not the single men. And they were often they would fall, and they would die off, and they were mistreated, these horses. And there is a story about her. She's riding up, and there's a guy who's missing, who's beating his horse, and she comes up and pulls her gun out and says, "I think that maybe you should be the one who shot him." I don't know. It was something like that, wasn't that?
That was
The essence of it. And who knows? But those are kind of some of the.
Some of them you never know, but there are others that once you get the whole picture, you say, "Yeah, I think that probably did happen."
Now, where was her homesteading claim in comparison to the hotel?
Her homestead claim?
Yeah.
It was in Dai.
How far away was
It was quite a distance, and the only way to get there was on a boat.
Oh, no.
Rowboat.
Oh, my gosh.
So she would row her boat. I don't know.
And did she or her children ever build anything besides that little cabin?
That was later. I think her kids were off in college, when she did that.
She did? She
Yeah.
built a house there? Or?
Well, I think
Shack.
she built a cabin.
Just that shack?
Today, it's just, there's nothing there.
Nothing.
The town of Dai actually got built at that spot,
Oh.
but it all, I don't know, it's gone now. And
Goes
the
down.
U.S. National Park Service has some plaques and history and photographs, and you can see the barn that she had at the time. And she hired, she didn't do all the farm work herself, but and actually she did have a house there, now that I think about it. And her daughter by that time had a couple of kids, and the daughter came and lived there for a time. So that would have been probably in the 1940s. But eventually it just, it was just too much.
So that's where she was breeding the horses?
Probably, yeah.
Up there.
Yeah, because there's pictures of her.
But she was trying to run the hotel at the same time?
Yeah, she was running the hotel.
Wow.
Going back and forth.
Back and forth on a boat.
Yeah.
Rowing.
Rowing.
Rowing
Right.
a boat.
Rowing a boat.
In the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, my word.
Yeah. Wait, Michael, this
Oh, I'm
man has a
sorry.
question.
I was just wondering, do you know if she had any specific religious beliefs?
I can't.
R-
answer.
uh,
Did she have any
religious
religious
beliefs?
beliefs?
Did she have
Did
any
she have religious beliefs? You know, she was raised as a Christian. Her father was absolutely devout. This guy AJ, whose diaries, I have 800 pages of his diaries that we photographed in the archive, and they're on my computer, which is the only way I could read them. You know, sitting in the archive was too hard to do. He was not just religious, he was a proselytizer his whole life, and he ended up joining the Salvation Army as an older man.
That's good.
And, you know, it was really, really central to his life. But Harriet, I don't think embraced that. I mean, like I said, she was raised as a Christian, she was raised going to church, and she had this father who was very adamant about morality, and he was part of a sect that developed in southeastern Pennsylvania, near Lancaster, and I can't think of the name, I'm blanking out, but it's not any religious groups that I had ever heard of. It was a rather small, you know,
Small stuff.
group of people. And then as he moved west with his various homesteading, there, at least until he got to Washington, but in Wisconsin and in South Dakota, he found like believers. And he ran Sunday school, and he actually became a minister. He became kind of ordained, although he never really had a congregation, by the Methodist Church. This is kind of an offshoot of the Methodist Church.
Right.
So that's, but she never exhibited.
So she probably was never really close with her father then?
Well, you know, they were living in the same place in Washington, and there were letters, a couple letters that went back and forth, and I do have some of his letters, and he mentions her, so he knew exactly what she was doing, and, you know, so they kept up with each other, but I think she just had other, you know, other interests and other things on her mind.
Thanks.
One of the things I see, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
is just how happy she looks.
What?
How happy she looks. She looks
I think-
content and
I think she,
really,
yeah, I
what'd you
think,
say, glowing?
I said, it's, what's that song say? I did it my way.
Yeah.
You know,
Sounds like
I-
she had a pretty good shot of that.
yeah, I think she was satisfied with her life, but my mother, by the time my mother got there, I think it was a year before the war started, so it was in 1941, I think the summer before the war, and she was there all summer. Her grandmother was an old lady, you know, over 80, and my mother always just said, oh, she was so grouchy, you know, she was impossible. She was not very nice to my mother and her cousin who went there to work in the hotel.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's
Yeah, I
teenage
got-
girls
yeah.
and
Right.
an old woman and,
Perspective.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I don't know if she looks nice, but she looks happy to me.
yeah.
How far did her education go? Did she have a high school diploma?
She only, well, you know, she was educated at home largely
Oh,
certainly in South Dakota, because when they got there were no schools, and then they started some schools. And in Washington, the whole family came down with, which disease? Wasn't scarlet fever.
smallpox?
Typhoid. The
Typhoid.
whole family got typhoid soon after they got to Washington. One of Harriet's sisters died of it. The others all recovered. And when they recovered, the mother took, well, you know, when they recovered, Harriet went to Olympia with a family, and I think she was probably like a nanny, and she went to school. So she got a little bit of schooling that way. But I think she really only went,
Oh.
you know, through the 8th grade, or
And how old was she when she married Dan?
she was
18,
20,
18 to 20.
no, I think she was 19,
19.
something like that, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because,
And Dan was how much older?
well, Dan was 18 years older
Oh,
than
my.
she,
Oh.
so
Wow.
he was well into his 30s.
No wonder the marriage didn't work.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you know.
That is fascinating.
Oh.
So
How
glad.
Yeah.
did
Heritage, quite a heritage.
Yeah.
How did he obtain his wealth? I mean, that was a huge house, so he must have had some good income.
You mean to
Dan,
build that house?
To build that house?
Oh, yeah, I mean, he was.
What did he do to get all that money?
He was when he first got there, he was a fur trapper.
Uh-huh.
And then he and his brother got a boat, and they were piloting ships
Oh,
in the channel that runs up around
Uh-huh.
the top of
he was a merchant.
the Olympic Peninsula.
Yeah.
And then he became a fur trader, but he ran a trading post at La Push.
Mhm.
So the Quileute people would bring their furs,
Uh-huh.
and he was working for somebody else, and the guy would get groceries and, I don't know, gunpowder and whatever people needed, and bring it. And his customers were both the Quileutes and the white settlers. I think the population in that area of white people was, you know, like 50 people. And then you have the Quileutes, which is maybe 200 in the tribe.
Uh-huh.
But it was an active trading post, and I think he got money that way. And he also had a farm inland, or ranch, and he raised cattle, and he would drive the cattle to Seattle and sell it.
Uh-huh.
And so he made money like that. And I don't know, they just somehow, because he certainly had nothing when he left Maine, you know. And they built this house, and they had servants, and
Oh, did
you
they?
know, for the
Oh,
brief
wow.
years,
Huh.
Harriet had all her clothes made by a seamstress, and
Huh. Oh, goodness.
people to take care of the kids. And then, you know, she became kind of like a hostess. You know, they had people come and sort of stay at the house, and,
Oh.
but then it just all fell apart, and they spent so much money on lawyers trying to defend themselves. There were two cases. One was the U.S. government
Oh.
trying to take the land away, and the other was the guy that Dan worked with the trading post, accused them of stealing stuff, and they were defending themselves. And I think in the end they won, but they spent a lot of time traveling distance to go to court and paying lawyers, and it just was just like one terrible challenge after another until there was nothing left.
Yeah. Now, was
What
her
impresses
maiden
you the
name
most
Moore?
about your
Was her
grandma?
maiden name Moore?
Her maiden name?
Moore. Was it Moore? I saw on a photograph under. her-
No, that was the name of the photographer,
Oh,
T.C.
oh, it
Moore.
was.
Her maiden name was Smith,
Smith.
and her
Okay.
father was Andrew Jackson Smith.
Uh-huh.
And Smith is the most common
Yeah.
surname
Yes.
in the United States, so that made my research really challenging. So many Smiths.
What impresses you the most about your great-grandma?
Personally, me personally.
Well, I think just that her persistence, just,
Grit.
Yeah.
I'm gonna find a way to take care of my children, to send them to educate them.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna find a way, and my husband is kind of a loser in the end.
Yeah.
Not you.
I was gonna say, she's modeled after her, but, oh, wait a minute.
So I think that was it, she just wouldn't take no for an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
It seems like with a spirit like hers, to be married, it doesn't sound like she could be subservient, that she would be actively participating in her husband's business affairs, or active doing something. Do you know anything about her role?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when they were running that trading post,
They were both.
I think she was part of that business. just like he was. I mean, I think she was really a force to be reckoned with. I mean, another story I found was about the time that they had tied up a bear in the front yard. I'm not sure why, like a pet or something. And the bear got loose and started chasing this little Indian boy. And she went out there with a lasso, got the bear, and you know. And then there was another story. Her brother became the teacher in the school, which was run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you know, government-run Indian school. They finally established a school in La Push because the Quileute people didn't want their children to go to a boarding school, which was one of the options. And so Harriet's older brother was the teacher for many years, a couple of decades. And there was one point where there was a conflict between him and his assistant teacher, who was a woman he eventually married. But there was a conflict between them and some of the Indian families. I think it had to do with disciplining the kids. And the Indians went after him, and Harriet was supposedly on the balcony of the house with a rifle, you know, telling everybody, keep cool or I'm going to shoot you. And, you know, things settled down and he continued to teach there. One of the really interesting things to me was the name Pullen. I said at the beginning, the way the Indians and the tribal elder, Lillian Pullen, where she got that name, is when Harriet's older brother became the teacher at the school, the Quileutes all had to give up their Indian language names, and he assigned them names: Washington, Hudson, Pullen, Lincoln, you know, sort of famous American names. And to this day, they all have, well, then at a certain point, in the middle of the 20th century, I think the Quileutes decided they wanted their Indian names. So now, when you look at the census, it'll often have both names.
Yeah.
But at the time her brother was teaching there, the goal, Bureau of Indian School, I mean, you know, the Bureau of Indian School goal was to extinguish Indian culture. And that was make them Christians, teach them to farm. We don't want any of this, you know, roaming around, and teach them English.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what he was trying to do. And that the attitudes have shifted a lot, thankfully, since then.
Did any of Harriet's children write anything about growing up in Alaska, their experiences?
Yeah, one of her sons, not my grandfather, but one of her sons lived to be 103.
Wow.
And he not only wrote a lot of stuff, but he was interviewed by various people because the family were considered Washington pioneers. Anybody who got to Washington before statehood, which was 1889, are considered pioneers. And so during the 1930s, there were people that went out, you know, interviewed and collected information. And so he got interviewed, and that material got published, which, you know, I was able to find in libraries. And he wrote about living next to the reservation and having these Indian children as his friends, and how they went to school together, and, you know, all kinds of amazing things. But I think he was the only one, because the daughter never wrote anything, and the other son died in college in an accident.
Tragic. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.